There was a year when America stood at the edge of something it couldn't yet see. A year that felt ordinary at the time, unremarkable even, but carried within it the seeds of everything that would follow. 1956 didn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply arrived, quiet as morning light through kitchen curtains. If you had asked someone then whether they were living through a moment of great change, they would have looked at you with puzzlement. Change was something that happened elsewhere, in distant capitals or on battlefields. At home, life moved with a familiar rhythm. The milk bottles appeared on doorsteps before dawn. The paperboy cycled past while dew still clung to the grass. Fathers knotted their ties in bedroom mirrors. Mothers measured coffee into percolators, and children argued over who got the prize from the cereal box. It all seemed permanent, solid, the way things had always been and would always be. But something was shifting beneath the surface, imperceptible as continental plates moving beneath the earth. The country was changing in ways too gradual to name, too subtle to resist. Years later, people would look back and wonder when exactly it happened. When did the world they knew slip away? When did the future they hadn't asked for arrive? The answer, for many, was somewhere in that unremarkable year, 1956. It wasn't a year of great catastrophes or celebrations. There were no declarations of war, no stock market collapses that would be remembered in history books. It was quieter than that, more intimate. The changes came not in headlines, but in habits. In the way families gathered around something new in their living rooms, in the roads being built just beyond town, in the houses springing up where cornfields used to be, in the slow, almost invisible rewiring of how Americans spent their time, their attention, their lives. This is a story about that year, about a country on the threshold, about people who went about their days not knowing they were living through a turning point, about the last moments of one America and the first stirrings of another. It's a story told not in dramatic events, but in quiet details, the texture of everyday life, the things people remember when they close their eyes and try to recall how it felt to be alive then. The sound of screen doors in summer, the smell of Sunday dinners, the particular quality of silence before the world got so loud. 1956 was the year America changed forever. But on January 1st, when people woke to a cold Sunday morning, nobody knew it yet. The morning always began the same way. Darkness first, then the gradual lightening of bedroom windows, then the sounds. A truck rumbling past on the main road, a dog barking 3 houses down, the clank of a furnace kicking on in the basement. In 1,000 small towns and 100 cities, the day unfolded with a rhythm that had remained unchanged for as long as anyone could remember. Men rose first, padding quietly to bathrooms, trying not to wake their wives just yet. They shaved with safety razors, their faces reflected in medicine cabinet mirrors that had seen the same ritual every morning for years. The scrape of blade against stubble, the splash of cold water, the sting of aftershave. By the time they came downstairs, their wives were already in the kitchens, coffee perking on the stove, filling the rooms with a smell that meant morning more than anything else could. Eggs in the skillet, toast browning, the radio on low, broadcasting news and weather and the day's first advertisements. Women in housecoats and slippers, hair still in curlers, moving through routines they could perform with their eyes closed. The children came last, stumbling downstairs, rubbing sleep from their eyes. They slumped at kitchen tables, poked at their breakfast, complained about school. Their fathers ate quickly, reading the newspaper folded beside their plates. The sports page first, then the front section. Stories about Eisenhower, about tensions overseas, about things that seemed very far away from this kitchen, this morning, this moment. By 7:30, the fathers were gone. out the door with lunch pails or briefcases, climbing into cars that started with a particular rumble and smelled of gasoline and old upholstery. They backed out of driveways, joined the streams of other men heading to factories, offices, shops, the world of work that would consume them until evening. The houses they left behind had a particular character, not large by any measure, but sturdy, built after the war, most of them, when there was finally money and materials again. 2 bedrooms, maybe 3, 1 bathroom, a living room with a good couch and matching chairs, a dining room for Sundays, kitchens with enough space for a table, a refrigerator, a stove, cabinets painted cheerful colors. These houses sat on streets lined with young trees, barely taller than a man. The lawns were small but carefully tended. Hedges marked property lines. Driveways led to single-car garages. Front porches held gliders or metal chairs where people sat on summer evenings, watching neighbors pass, calling out greetings. There was a sameness to it all that didn't feel oppressive then. It felt like belonging, like being part of something larger than yourself. When you looked down your street and saw houses similar to your own, families similar to yours, routines that mirrored your own, it created a sense of security. You knew where you stood. You knew the rules. You knew what was expected. After the fathers left, the mothers turned their attention to getting children ready for school. Faces washed, hair combed, lunches packed in brown paper bags, a sandwich, an apple, cookies wrapped in waxed paper. The children grabbed their books, their jackets, their lunch pails decorated with cowboys or spacemen. They headed out the door in small groups, walking to schools that were close enough to reach on foot. No one drove them, no one worried. The children walked down sidewalks, cut through yards, took shortcuts everyone knew. They traveled in packs, the older ones looking after the younger. They knew every crack in the pavement, every dog that might bark, every house where you could retrieve a ball from the yard without getting yelled at. School buildings were solid brick structures, 2 or 3 stories, built to last generations. Inside, they smelled of chalk dust and floor wax and cafeteria cooking. The hallways echoed with children's voices until bells rang and teachers appeared in doorways, calling their classes to order. Classrooms had tall windows that let in good light, rows of wooden desks scarred by decades of use, with inkwells that hadn't held ink in years. Blackboards covered with lessons, American flags in corners, portraits of Washington and Lincoln, everything orderly, predictable, the same as it had been when these teachers were children themselves. The lessons were straightforward: reading, writing, arithmetic, history that celebrated American progress, geography that made the world seem vast and foreign, science that dealt in facts and formulas. The teachers were women, mostly, unmarried or widowed, dedicated to their profession. They maintained discipline with firm voices and occasionally a ruler on a desk. Children learned to sit still, speak when spoken to, raise their hands, show respect. At noon, everyone went to the cafeteria or walked home for lunch if they lived close enough. Hot meals served on compartmented trays, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, fish on Fridays, corn and green beans from industrial-sized cans, cartons of milk cold and sweating. The noise in those cafeterias was tremendous. Hundreds of children talking, laughing, trading items from their lunchboxes, living in a world entirely their own. The afternoon wore on with more lessons, then the final bell. Children poured out of schools like water released from a dam. They walked home the same routes they'd taken that morning, in no particular hurry. Some stopped at corner stores where penny candy still cost a penny, Mary Jane's, Tootsie Rolls, strips of paper with dots of colored sugar. They'd hand over their coins and receive their treasures, eating them slowly to make them last. At home, mothers were waiting. Many had spent their days cleaning, shopping, preparing dinner. They'd walked to nearby stores, chatted with shopkeepers who knew their names, their families, their usual orders. A pound of ground beef, a loaf of bread, a quart of milk. Everything handed across counters, wrapped in white paper, recorded in small notebooks. A dozen eggs cost about 60 cents, a gallon of milk just under $1. Ground beef ran about 50 cents a pound, a loaf of bread 18 cents. These prices felt reasonable against wages that averaged around $75 a week for working men. A family could live on it, not lavishly, but comfortably enough. There was money for rent, for food, for clothing when needed, maybe a little left over for the movies on Saturday night. The afternoons had a particular quality, quiet mostly. Children playing outside, their voices carrying on the air. Women visiting across back fences, hanging laundry on clotheslines that stretched between metal poles. Sheets and shirts and dresses dancing in the breeze. The smell of fresh laundry, the snap of fabric. Small moments that felt like nothing special at the time.
Some women listened to the radio while they worked. Soap operas in the afternoons, serialized stories of love and loss that millions followed faithfully. These programs created their own kind of community. Women across the country tuning in at the same time, invested in the same characters, anticipating the same plot twists. It gave them something to discuss, something shared. As evening approached, the fathers returned. Cars pulling into driveways, tired men climbing out, loosening ties, glad to be home. The transition between work and home life was quick. A few minutes to change clothes, wash hands, then into the kitchen where dinner was nearly ready. Families ate together. This wasn't a rule that needed enforcing, it was simply what people did. Everyone at the table at the same time. Pot roast or fried chicken or pork chops, potatoes in some form, vegetables, bread and butter, milk for the children, coffee for the adults, dessert if there was something left from the weekend baking. Conversation happened naturally. How was school? How was work? What did the neighbors say? Small talk mostly, nothing profound, but it was connection. It was paying attention to each other. It was a daily ritual that knitted families together without anyone thinking much about it. After dinner, children did homework at kitchen tables while mothers washed dishes and fathers read the evening paper. By 8 o'clock, younger children were heading to bed. By 9, the house grew quiet. Adults might sit together for a while, talk about bills, about plans for the weekend, about nothing in particular. By 10, most houses on the street were dark. People went to bed early because they rose early. The cycle would begin again in a few hours. Same routines, same rhythms, day after day, week after week. It created a sense of stability, of knowing what to expect, of life being predictable in ways that felt comforting rather than confining. Weekends broke the pattern slightly. Saturday mornings, fathers might work on the yard, fix things around the house, wash the car in the driveway. Children played with a freedom they didn't have during the school week. Mothers did heavier cleaning, baking for the week ahead. Saturday afternoons might include errands, a trip downtown, maybe a matinee at the movie theater where cartoons played before the main feature. Saturday nights were special. Families cleaned up, dressed a little nicer, went out. Dinner at a restaurant, though not an expensive one. The movies, maybe bowling. It was a chance to be among others, to participate in the life of the town, to feel connected to something larger than your own four walls. Sundays were different entirely. Church in the morning, almost without exception, Protestant services that followed familiar patterns, hymns everyone knew by heart, sermons about sin and redemption and living right, Sunday school for children, fellowship afterward on church lawns, adults talking, children running between them. Sunday dinner was the week's best meal, a roast in the oven since morning, filling the house with its smell, the good dishes on the table, everyone dressed nicely. Sometimes relatives came,
Grandparents or aunts and uncles or cousins, the meals stretched out, leisurely, nobody in a hurry. Sunday afternoons were for rest. Men napped in front of radios broadcasting baseball games. Women read or wrote letters. Children played quietly, knowing better than to make too much noise on Sunday. It was a day set apart, a day of rest in the truest sense. Time moved differently on Sundays, slower, gentler, as if the entire country took a collective breath. This was the texture of life in 1956, not exciting by any measure, not dramatic, just steady, dependable, built on routines that gave shape to days and weeks and years. People knew their neighbors, they left doors unlocked, they sent children out to play and didn't worry. They trusted that tomorrow would be much like today, and the day after that the same. There was an innocence to it, not the innocence of ignorance exactly. People knew the world had dangers, they'd lived through a depression and a war, they knew hardship. But there was still a fundamental belief that life was getting better, that their children would have more than they'd had, that America was moving forward, progressing, becoming something greater. Nobody guessed that this particular way of life, these particular rhythms, were already beginning to fade, that forces were at work, quiet and persistent, that would reshape everything. In 1956, it all still felt permanent, unshakable, the way things would always be.
But even as life followed its familiar patterns, something new was entering American homes, something that would change everything, though nobody quite realized it yet. Television. Not every family had one in 1956, but more did than the year before, and more would by the year after. The sets themselves were pieces of furniture. Large wooden cabinets with small screens, maybe 12 or 14 inches. They sat in living rooms like shrines. Families arranged their furniture around them. The couch faced the television now, not the fireplace, not the window, not each other. At first, television seemed like an extension of radio, another form of entertainment, that's all. Families gathered around it the same way they'd gathered around radios, but something was different. With radio, you could move around, do other things. Your hands were free, your eyes were free. Radio was background to life. Television demanded your attention. Your eyes had to be on the screen. You had to sit still. You had to watch. And people did. They watched variety shows on Sunday nights. They watched westerns and comedies and quiz shows. They watched the news, seeing for the first time the faces of the men who reported the world to them. The programs themselves were simple, wholesome, comedies about families much like the ones watching, adventures that always ended well, variety shows with singers and comedians and dancers, nothing challenging, nothing that questioned or probed or made you uncomfortable. Television reflected America back to itself as it wanted to be seen, clean, happy, uncomplicated. But even these innocent programs were changing something fundamental. The rhythm of family life began to organize itself around broadcast schedules. Dinner had to be finished by 7:30 because that's when your favorite show started. Conversations were interrupted by programs. Children who used to play outside until called for bed now wanted to stay inside to watch. The shows came into your home, but they were the same shows going into every home. Millions of people watching the same thing at the same time. It created a kind of shared experience, but a strange one. You weren't experiencing it together with other people, you were experiencing it alone in your living room, while knowing others were doing the same in their living rooms. Something else was happening too, between the programs. Advertisements, quick, bright little films trying to sell you things, cigarettes and cars and soap and cereal and 1,000 other products. The advertisements were slicker than the programs sometimes, more energetic, more insistent. They worked on you in ways you didn't quite notice, planting wants, creating needs, suggesting that your life could be better, happier, more complete if only you bought the right things.
The voices were cheerful and confident. They made promises. They showed you families who seemed just slightly more perfect than yours, living in houses just slightly nicer, using products that solved problems you didn't know you had. Consumerism wasn't new in 1956. People had always bought things, but television gave advertisers direct access to every home every evening. It created a constant drumbeat of desire. Buy this, buy that, buy more. Your neighbors were buying, shouldn't you? And people did buy. They had more money than their parents' generation. The war was over, the depression was over, jobs were plentiful, factories were humming, wages were rising. After years of doing without, people wanted things, nice things, new things, things that made life easier and more pleasant.
The homes that seemed perfectly adequate a few years earlier now felt small, simple. People began to want more space, more rooms, newer appliances, better furniture, bigger yards, houses in better neighborhoods. Developers understood this. Across the country, in the spaces between cities and countryside, they were building. Subdivisions, they called them. Acre after acre of new houses, all similar, all affordable. Houses with 3 bedrooms instead of 2, with carports or garages, with modern kitchens and built-in appliances, with lawns and driveways and young trees planted in precise rows. These subdivisions were usually outside the old city centers. You needed a car to live there, but more families had cars now. The highways made it possible to live farther from work. 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even 45 minutes of driving seemed acceptable if it meant a newer, bigger house in a quieter neighborhood. The highways themselves were expanding. 1956 was the year the interstate highway system was born, though few people paid much attention to the legislation. It seemed like a practical thing, better roads for a growing country. But those highways would reshape America. They would determine where people lived, where businesses located, which towns thrived and which faded. They would make cars not just convenient, but necessary. In the cities people were leaving, something was being lost. The corner stores where shopkeepers knew your name, the neighborhoods where generations of families had lived, the sense of community that came from density, from being among people, from encountering neighbors not by choice, but by circumstance. The suburbs promised something different: space, privacy, newness, your own piece of land, a yard for children, distance from the noise and dirt and crowds of the city. It seemed like progress, like improvement, like the fulfillment of the American dream. But it came at a cost that wasn't immediately visible. In the suburbs, you couldn't walk to the store, you couldn't walk to work, you couldn't walk anywhere that mattered. You drove. Every errand required a car. Every visit required planning. You couldn't just step outside and be among people. You were isolated in ways that didn't feel like isolation because you'd chosen it. The houses sat on their lots, separated by lawns. The streets curved in ways that discouraged walking. There were no sidewalks in many places, no corner stores, no cafes, no public spaces where people might gather. Just houses and yards and quiet streets. People told themselves this was what they wanted: peace, quiet, safety, and it was those things, but it was also the beginning of a kind of loneliness that would only grow deeper as the years passed, a physical separation that would become an emotional one. Something else was happening beneath the quiet calm of 1956, a fear, quiet but persistent, that people didn't talk about directly but shaped their lives anyway. The fear of communism, of nuclear war, of an enemy that seemed implacable and powerful and very far away, but somehow threatening nonetheless. This wasn't the hot fear of immediate danger. It was colder, more abstract, but it was there, coloring everything. Children practiced drills at school, diving under desks at the sound of a bell, as if those wooden desks could protect them from anything.
Families discussed building bomb shelters in their backyards. Civil defense pamphlets circulated, explaining what to do in case of attack. Movies showed mushroom clouds and devastated cities and warned of the communist threat.
The fear never quite reached panic, but it was always there, a low hum beneath everyday life. It made people crave security, normalcy, stability. It made them suspicious of anything too different, too questioning, too outside the mainstream. Better to conform, better to be like everyone else, better not to stand out. In this atmosphere, deviation became dangerous. People who thought differently, who challenged the prevailing wisdom, who asked uncomfortable questions, found themselves under suspicion. The investigations, the blacklists, the destroyed careers, it created a climate where silence seemed safer than speech, where going along seemed wiser than standing apart. Most people didn't experience this fear as oppression. They experienced it as patriotism, as vigilance, as doing their duty to protect America from a genuine threat. They weren't wrong that the threat existed, but the fear itself changed things, made the country harder, less generous, less open to difference. And underneath even that fear was something else, a deeper anxiety that people couldn't quite name, the sense that the world was moving too fast, that technology was outpacing wisdom, that humanity had created weapons it didn't know how to control, that the future wasn't necessarily going to be better than the past. Nuclear energy promised unlimited power and carried the seeds of unlimited destruction. Rockets that could reach space could also deliver bombs across continents. Science that could cure diseases could also create horrors. Progress didn't seem as purely good as it once had. But these anxieties remained mostly unspoken in 1956. People went about their days, they worked and raised families and pursued happiness. They bought televisions and moved to suburbs and drove on new highways. They watched their shows and mowed their lawns and tried not to think too much about mushroom clouds. The changes were invisible because they happened slowly. Each small shift seemed insignificant on its own. Buying a television, moving to a suburb, driving instead of walking, watching instead of talking. None of it felt like loss at the time. It felt like gain, like improvement, like getting ahead. People didn't realize they were trading one kind of life for another, that something was being left behind, even as something new was being claimed. They thought they were simply living, making reasonable choices, doing what was best for their families. The irony was that everyone was making the same reasonable choices at the same time, and the cumulative effect was transforming the entire country. Individual decisions were creating collective change. Personal choices were reshaping society. But you couldn't see that from inside a single life. You could only see your own circumstances, your own challenges, your own attempts to build something good. By the end of 1956, millions of families owned televisions who hadn't owned them at the beginning. Thousands of families had moved to suburbs that didn't exist a year earlier. Hundreds of miles of new highway had been built. The physical landscape of America was changing. But more importantly, the internal landscape was changing too. The way people spent their time, the way they connected with neighbors, the way they thought about themselves and their place in the world, the nature of community, the meaning of home, the texture of daily life, all of it shifting, subtly but certainly, in directions no one had quite chosen, but everyone was moving toward together. There were things that disappeared so gradually that no one thought to mourn them until they were already gone. The front porch, for instance. Not the structure itself, which remained on many houses, but the use of it. The habit of sitting outside in the evening, watching the world pass by, calling out to neighbors, being visible, being part of the street's life. People were inside now, in front of televisions. The newer houses in the suburbs often had small front porches, or none at all. Instead, they had back patios, private spaces facing away from the street. You could sit outside without being seen, without having to interact. It seemed like an improvement, privacy, but it was also isolation. The sidewalks grew quieter. People drove everywhere. The children who had walked to school in large groups were fewer now. Some suburbs had no sidewalks at all, just streets and cars. Walking became something you did for exercise, not transportation. Something you chose to do, not something necessary. The casual encounters that had filled daily life became rarer. You used to see people at the corner store, at the post office, walking down the street. You'd stop and talk. Nothing important, usually, just small exchanges that acknowledged each other's existence. How are you? How's the family? Weather's been nice. These tiny threads that wove people together. But when you drove everywhere, you didn't encounter people by chance. You were enclosed in your car, moving from one private space to another. The store, the office, home. Always indoors or inside a vehicle. The in-between spaces, the public spaces, the casual mingling disappeared. Even shopping was changing. The small stores where proprietors knew their customers were struggling against new competition. Supermarkets, where you walked aisles with a cart, selecting items yourself, checking out with a cashier who didn't know your name. It was more efficient, more convenient, cheaper often, but something was lost. The butcher who knew how you liked your meat cut, the grocer who set aside the best produce for his regulars, the druggist who remembered your prescriptions and asked about your health. These relationships dissolved. Shopping became a transaction rather than an interaction. Faster, yes, but lonelier. Families were changing too, in ways so subtle they were almost invisible. The television in the living room meant less conversation. The move to suburbs meant extended families lived farther apart. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins who used to be encountered regularly became people you saw on holidays, if then. The tight networks of relatives who had provided support, advice, childcare, companionship began to loosen. Young families were more independent, more on their own. This seemed fine, modern, a sign of success that you didn't need to rely on relatives, but it also meant more isolation, less help, fewer people who knew your history, your struggles, your children.
Sunday dinners with extended family became less common. The casual dropping by that had been normal when people lived close to each other faded. You had to plan visits now, drive distances, make arrangements. Family became something you scheduled rather than something you simply lived among. Even within families, the changes were occurring. Fathers had always worked outside the home, but they'd worked closer to home. They'd come home for lunch sometimes. They'd been present in the community. Now they were commuting farther, gone longer, more tired when they returned. The distance between work and home wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The father became a figure who appeared in the evening, weary from a world his family didn't see. Mothers who had always worked, though their work hadn't been called work, found their roles narrowing even as their houses expanded. The new appliances that promised to make life easier somehow didn't reduce the hours spent on housework. The standards rose instead. The house had to be cleaner, the meals more elaborate, the children more attended to. And there was a peculiar loneliness to it. Isolated in suburban houses, without extended family nearby, without corner stores where you'd chat with other women, without porches where neighbors would stop by, many women felt an emptiness they couldn't quite name. They had what they were supposed to want, nice houses, good appliances, healthy children, but something felt missing. The children were changing too. They had more than their parents had as children. More toys, more space, newer clothes, but they were also more isolated.
In the suburbs, houses were spread out. Children couldn't just run next door. Playing with friends required parental coordination, driving, scheduling. The packs of children who had roamed neighborhoods together, creating their own games, solving their own disputes, learning independence through necessity, were becoming rarer. Children were more supervised, more protected, more dependent on adults to arrange their social lives. Something about childhood was shifting, from communal to individual, from outdoor to indoor, from unsupervised to managed. It seemed safer, seemed better, but something wild and free was being lost. Radio was changing, not disappearing exactly, but losing its central place in family life. Radio had been communal. Families gathered around it together. But now, television occupied that space. Radio became something for background, for listening while doing other things. It persisted, but it mattered less. The programs that had captivated millions, the serial dramas and comedy shows and variety programs were moving to television or ending. Radio became music and news and talk, filling the space but no longer commanding attention. Another small loss, another way people spent less time together paying attention to the same thing at the same time. Letter writing was declining, not obviously, not dramatically, but people called on the telephone more often now, especially as long-distance rates dropped. A phone call was immediate, convenient, but letters had been different, thoughtful, considered, physical objects that could be saved and reread, connections that lasted beyond the moment. People wrote fewer letters to distant relatives, to old friends, to children away at college. They called instead, had quick conversations, got the necessary information, maintained contact, but the deep connection that came from sitting down to write, to reflect, to share yourself on paper, that was fading. Neighborhoods were losing their memory. The old neighborhoods had deep histories, multiple generations, people who knew not just you, but your parents, your grandparents, stories passed down, connections that went back decades. The new suburbs had none of that. Everyone arrived at the same time. Everyone was starting fresh. It created a kind of freedom, but also a rootlessness. Without that historical memory, without those deep connections, neighborhoods became more temporary. People moved more easily. Houses became investments rather than homes you'd occupy for life. Neighbors became friendly acquaintances rather than people who knew your family's entire story. Churches remained central in 1956, but they too were changing. In the old neighborhoods, churches had been community centers, places where multiple generations gathered, where social life revolved. The new suburban churches were different. Newer buildings, congregations of families all roughly the same age, all in similar circumstances. The sense of being part of something ancient, something that preceded and would outlast you, was harder to feel. Even the churches began to organize themselves differently. More programs, more activities, less spontaneous gathering and more scheduled events. The casual fellowship gave way to committee meetings and planned socials. It was more organized but felt less organic. The dinner table was one of the last holdouts. Most families still ate together in 1956, but the television was pulling at this ritual. Some families moved the dinner hour to accommodate broadcasts. Some angled their tables so they could see the screen while eating. The conversation that had been the point of gathering was becoming secondary to watching. Music in the home was changing too. Families used to play instruments together, gather around pianos, sing. But this required skill, practice, effort. Why bother when you could simply turn on the television or radio and hear professional musicians? The active creation of music became passive consumption. Another small loss, another way people became audiences rather than participants in their own lives. The relationship with time itself was shifting. Life had always had its rhythms, but they'd been natural rhythms. Daylight and darkness, seasons, the agricultural calendar even for people who no longer farmed. But now time was becoming more segmented, more scheduled, organized around broadcasts, appointments, school schedules, work shifts. There was less margin, less empty time, less boredom, which sounds good, but boredom is where creativity lives, where children invent their own games, where people think, where ideas form. The filling of every moment with activity, with noise, with stimulation left less room for reflection. People moved faster, were busier, had more to do, more places to be. The car made distance less of an obstacle, so distance expanded to fill the time saved. You could drive 20 miles to shop instead of walking 2 blocks. You could visit friends across town instead of just next door. Movement became easier, but also more necessary. You couldn't not move because everything was farther away. The quiet was disappearing. Radio, television, cars, appliances, all of them added noise to life. There were fewer moments of actual silence, fewer times when you sat with nothing to do, nothing to distract you, nothing but your own thoughts. People told themselves this was better, more interesting, less boring. But the loss of quiet was also a loss of something necessary.
Trust was beginning to erode too, though not in obvious ways. People still left doors unlocked in 1956, still sent children out to play without worry, but the seeds of fear were being planted. News reports of crimes in distant places, stories of danger that television brought into living rooms, the sense that the world might not be as safe as it once seemed. This would grow in years to come, but it started here. The slow shift from assuming the best about strangers to being cautious, from seeing neighbors as extensions of family to seeing them as people you didn't quite know, from trusting the community to trusting only those closest to you. None of these changes happened all at once. None were dramatic enough to register as significant at the time. They were small adjustments, tiny shifts in habit and routine, things that seemed convenient or modern or simply the way things were now. But they added up. Each small change led to others. Each habit abandoned opened space for new habits that pulled people further from the old ways of living. It was like a river slowly changing course. No single moment when it happened, just a gradual movement that over time left the old channel dry and the water flowing somewhere new. People didn't notice because they were living their lives, trying to do right by their families, pursuing happiness, making the best choices they knew how to make. They weren't trying to change the world, they were trying to navigate it. But their individual choices, multiplied across millions of families, were remaking the country. And the loss only becomes clear in retrospect, when you look back and realize that something fundamental has changed, that the texture of daily life is different, that the connections between people have loosened, that the world has become louder and faster and lonelier, without anyone quite deciding that's what they wanted. 1956 was when these changes reached a tipping point. Not the beginning, not the end, but the moment when the old way of life and the new way of life balanced briefly before tipping toward the future. The last year when someone alive could remember life before television, before suburbs, before the interstate system, before the constant noise and speed and isolation became normal. The people living through it didn't know this, of course. They thought they were simply living, and they were. But they were also witnessing and participating in the end of something that would never quite come back.
December arrived cold and clear. Christmas decorations appeared in windows, on front lawns, wrapped around porch columns. The traditions continued as they always had. Trees cut and brought inside, decorated with ornaments saved year after year, presents wrapped in bright paper and hidden in closets, cookies baked in warm kitchens, carols on the radio. For children, December felt endless. The anticipation of Christmas morning stretched time to its limit. They counted days, made lists, shook packages trying to guess contents. The world seemed full of magic and possibility in those weeks before Christmas. Adults moved through the season with their own rituals, shopping for presents, mailing cards to relatives far away, planning meals for Christmas Day. There was stress, certainly, and expense, but there was also something deeper, a sense of connection to the past, to their own childhoods, to generations before them who had celebrated the same way. The churches filled on Christmas Eve, families dressed in their best, arriving early for candlelight services, the old hymns sung in the dim light, the Christmas story read once again, the same words, the same music, the same reverence. It created a feeling of continuity, of being part of something larger and more enduring than your own life. On Christmas morning, houses erupted in joyful chaos, children racing to see what Santa had brought, parents watching their excitement, drinking coffee, trying to preserve the moment in memory. The unwrapping of presents, the exclamations of delight, the playing with new toys while adults prepared the big meal. Christmas dinner brought families together. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins crowding around tables, turkey or ham, potatoes and stuffing and vegetables and pies. Too much food, always. The warmth of being together, the noise of multiple conversations happening at once, children wiggling in their seats, eager to return to their new toys but required to sit and be part of the family gathering. After the meal, after the dishes were done, families settled into the comfortable tiredness of Christmas afternoon. The men dozed in chairs, the women talked in the kitchen, the children played. The house smelled of cooking and pine. Outside, the winter afternoon faded to evening. Lights on houses up and down the street glowed warm against the darkness.
This was the America people believed in. Families together, homes filled with love and laughter, traditions passed down and carried forward. It felt real and true and permanent. It felt like the way things were supposed to be. As December moved toward its end, there was a brief pause. The week between Christmas and New Year, when time seemed suspended. Work and school were on break. The rush of the holiday passed. The New Year not yet arrived. A strange, quiet interval. Time to rest. Time to reflect, though most people didn't reflect much, just enjoyed the stillness. New Year's Eve came with its own traditions, parties or quiet evenings at home, staying up until midnight, which felt important for reasons hard to explain. The countdown, the cheers, the kissing, Auld Lang Syne on the radio. The sense of ending and beginning happening simultaneously. On January 1st, 1957, people woke to hangovers or simply to the quiet of a holiday morning. The year ahead stretched out before them, unknown and full of possibility. They made resolutions, most of which wouldn't last beyond January. They thought about their lives, their hopes, their plans. They went to bed that night believing that the new year would be much like the old one. Better, hopefully, more prosperous, but fundamentally the same. They didn't know what was coming, couldn't have known. The changes that had begun in 1956 would accelerate in the years that followed. Television would dominate completely. Suburbs would sprawl across the landscape. Highways would reshape the country. The pace of life would quicken. The noise would grow louder. The isolation would deepen. But there would also be progress, real progress, in civil rights, in opportunities, in the opening of society to people who had been excluded. The same forces that were breaking down old communities were also breaking down old restrictions. The same mobility that separated families also freed individuals to pursue lives they couldn't have lived in more rigid times. The story of what happened after 1956 is complicated, not simply loss or gain, both together, tangled in ways impossible to separate. The convenience of modern life came with costs. The freedom came with loneliness. The progress came with disruption. But in 1956, none of that was clear yet. The future was still hidden. People went about their days not knowing they were living through a hinge point in history, a moment when America pivoted from one way of being to another, when the old world and the new world briefly coexisted before the new one took over completely. The people of 1956 did the best they knew how, made choices that seemed reasonable, pursued dreams that seemed worthy. They wanted good lives for their families. They wanted to be safe and comfortable and happy. They weren't wrong to want those things. But wanting and getting are different. And getting what you want sometimes means losing what you had. The secure neighborhoods came with isolation. The bigger houses came with debt and distance from work. The convenience came with disconnection. The entertainment came at the cost of conversation. None of it was intended. No one set out to make life lonelier or faster or noisier. They just made individual choices that happened to add up to collective transformation. That's how history works most of the time. Not through grand plans or deliberate schemes, but through millions of small decisions that accumulate into something nobody quite chose.
There's a photograph that might have been taken in 1956. It exists in many versions, in many family albums. A street in an American town, small houses lined up neatly, young trees, sidewalks, a few cars parked at curbs, maybe some children playing in a yard. An ordinary moment on an ordinary day. Looking at that photograph now, knowing what came after, it's impossible not to feel something. Not quite sadness, not quite nostalgia, something more complex. A recognition that those people lived in a world that no longer exists, that the children in that yard grew up into a different America than the one their parents inhabited, that the rhythms and textures of daily life shifted in ways that can never be reversed. It would be easy to romanticize 1956, to remember only the good parts, the safety, the community, the simplicity, to forget the limitations, the restrictions, the injustices that were very real and very harmful. The past is never as pure as memory makes it, but it would also be wrong to dismiss what was lost as progress marched forward. Real things were lost, ways of connecting, of living, of being present to each other. These weren't trivial. They mattered. They shaped human experience in profound ways. The people of 1956 were not better than we are, not wiser, not more virtuous. They were just people, with all the flaws and failings people always have. But they lived in a world that was organized differently, where speed and convenience hadn't yet become the highest values, where efficiency hadn't overridden everything else, where there was still room for slowness, for quiet, for the unscheduled encounters that create community. That world ended gradually, not in 1956 exactly, but sometime around then, the tipping point where the old gave way to the new, where America became something different than it had been. Not worse, necessarily, not better either, just different. We live now in the world that was born then, in the suburbs that spread across the landscape, on the highways that connect everything, with the televisions that command our attention, with the speed and convenience and isolation that seemed like such improvements at the time. We've inherited both the benefits and the costs. Understanding 1956 isn't about going back. That's impossible. The world is changed too fundamentally. The technology exists, the suburbs are built, the highways are paved. You can't undo any of it, and it's not clear you should want to. But understanding what was lost helps clarify what matters, what's worth protecting or reclaiming or creating anew in different forms. The face-to-face connections, the unscheduled time, the public spaces where people encounter each other, the slowness that allows for depth, the quiet that allows for thought. These things didn't disappear because people stopped valuing them. They disappeared because other values crowded them out. Convenience over connection, privacy over community, speed over reflection, entertainment over conversation, individual choice over collective experience.
Each of these trade-offs seemed reasonable at the time, made sense for individual families making individual decisions, but the cumulative effect was a society that became harder, faster, lonelier, noisier, where people are more isolated despite being more connected, where we have more ways to communicate but less to say, where we're busier but not necessarily doing anything more meaningful. The story of 1956 is a reminder that societies change through the accumulation of small choices, that what seems like progress can contain within it the seeds of loss, that convenience and connection can work against each other, that getting what you think you want might cost you things you didn't know you needed. But it's also a reminder of human resilience. The people who lived through those changes adapted, found new ways to create meaning, built communities in different forms, found connection despite the isolation, made lives that mattered despite the challenges. And that continues. Every generation faces its own moment of transition, its own tipping point where the old world gives way to new. The specific changes differ, but the experience is the same. The sense that something fundamental is shifting, that life as you knew it is ending, and something different is beginning. We're living through such a moment now. Different technologies, different pressures, different changes, but the same basic challenge: how to hold on to what matters while adapting to what's new. How to preserve connection in an age of increasing isolation. How to create community in a world organized around individual convenience. How to maintain slowness and depth in a culture of speed and surface. There are no easy answers. There weren't in 1956, and there aren't now. But there's value in recognizing the patterns, in understanding that what we're experiencing isn't unique, that our grandparents and great-grandparents faced similar moments when the world seemed to be changing too fast, when old certainties were dissolving, when the future seemed both promising and threatening. They survived those changes, found ways to live meaningful lives despite everything, built families and communities and lives that mattered. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but they did it. And so will we, not by going back, not by pretending the changes haven't happened, but by learning from the past, by understanding what was lost so we can consciously preserve or recreate it in new forms, by making choices, individual and collective, that prioritize what matters most. The year 1956 is gone. The America it represented is gone. The people who lived through it are mostly gone too, but the memory persists, in photographs and stories, in the way older people describe what life used to be like, in the sense that something valuable has been lost even as much has been gained. That memory matters, not to paralyze us with nostalgia, not to pretend the past was better than it was, but to remind us that the way we live now is not the only way to live, that the values we take for granted aren't universal, that the trajectory we're on isn't inevitable. We can make different choices, build different communities, organize our lives around different priorities. It won't be easy. The momentum of history is powerful. The structures we've built constrain our options, but it's possible. The people of 1956 didn't know they were living through a transformation, but we have the advantage of hindsight. We can see what happened, understand the costs and benefits, make more conscious choices about what we preserve and what we discard. That's the gift of history, not certainty, Not easy answers, but perspective, understanding, the long view that helps us see beyond the immediate moment to the larger patterns and deeper truths. 1956 was the year America changed forever. But every year is the year something changes. Every day we make choices that shape the future. The question isn't whether change will happen, it's whether we'll be conscious participants in it or passive recipients, whether we'll shape it or simply be shaped by it. The people of 1956 didn't get to choose. They lived through changes they barely recognized until they were over. We don't have to repeat that. We can be more aware, more intentional, more deliberate about what we're building and what we're leaving behind. That's what 1956 teaches us, not to fear change, not to resist progress, but to be mindful of what we're losing even as we gain, to preserve what matters most even as we embrace what's new, to build a future that honors the past without being bound by it. It's a hard balance. It's always been hard, but it's worth attempting. For ourselves, for our families, for the communities we build, and the world we leave behind. The story of 1956 is ultimately a story about being human, about building lives that matter in times of change, about making choices, sometimes blindly, that shape not just our own futures, but the futures of generations to come. The story continues. It's ours now, and how we write the next chapter depends on whether we learned anything from the chapters that came before. The sun sets on another day, another year, another era, and rises on something new, always, forever. That's the pattern of human life. The only question is whether we'll meet the future with wisdom learned from the past or repeat the same mistakes, the same blindness, the same failure to see what we're losing even as we gain. 1956 couldn't answer that question. Neither can we entirely, but we can try. We can pay attention. We can choose consciously. We can build deliberately. And maybe, years from now, people looking back at our time will see that we did our best, that we learned from those who came before, that we preserved what mattered while building something new. That's all anyone can do. That's all the people of 1956 did. And somehow, despite everything, it was enough. Life went on. Communities formed. Meaning was made. Love survived. It always does, through all the changes and losses and gains, through the transformations we notice and the ones we don't, through the conscious choices and the ones we make without thinking. Life continues, and with it, hope. Not that everything will be perfect, not that we'll avoid all mistakes, but that we'll keep trying, keep building, keep connecting, keep creating meaning despite the challenges. That's what 1956 teaches us in the end. Not that the past was better, not that we should go back, but that every generation faces its moment, every era has its challenges, and somehow we continue, adapting, changing, surviving, sometimes even thriving. The story goes on, ours to write now, with whatever wisdom we can gather from those who came before, with whatever courage we can muster for what comes next, with whatever love we can maintain despite everything that would pull us apart. The year America changed forever was 1956, but America is always changing, always becoming something new. The question isn't whether it will change, it's what it will become, and that's up to us.